All right, since I moved the internet fitness drama bullshit to a separate series, I'm just going to jump straight back into overload from part one, and I apologize for missing last week. Let me start by redefining terms so we're clear. The overload principle states that habitually overloading a physiological system will cause it to respond and adapt to that stressor. The principle of progressive overload states that once an athlete has adapted to a certain training load, the subsequent training stimulus must be progressively increased in order to achieve a further and improved adaptation. And this comes from Peak Performance by John Hawley and Louise Burke. Okay, pretty straightforward, but I want to hammer a couple points home. Again, overload represents, as it said, the habitual stimulus. Now, habitual, there is no time frame given here beyond however long it takes the adaptation to occur. It is the habitual combination of frequency, intensity, volume, which could mean duration. It can mean the number of repetitions, sets, reps, depending on the activity that's being done. Type is not generally progressed in the same way, or it tends to be so specific, right, that you wouldn't see it really being considered in the same sort of terms. So, for a cyclist, there's no real progression in the bike. And if I can think of any examples, which will probably be weight room related because that's where it always gets more complicated, I'll mention them, but right now nothing comes to mind. In any case, overload is simply the habitual combination of those factors, specific to developing the adaptation that you're seeking. And I'd only note, and this will make sense when I get to more examples, for any specific adaptation you're seeking, there tends to be a certain combination of frequency, intensity, and volume that is aimed at that. And now in 2024, after decades of both trial and error in sports science, we're pretty clear on what those are, like what the combinations need to be to get specific adaptations. I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot new other than maybe some minor detail, whatever, getting ahead of myself. That's overload. Progression, previously progressive overload, simply says that once that habitual overload has led to an adaptation, over whatever time frame that takes, whether it's a day, a week, a month, might be longer, might be less, depends on the adaptation, depends on a whole bunch of factors. At that point, you must progress the training, assuming you want to get further adaptations, right? And in the case that you don't, where you're as fit or as you need to be, you don't have to apply progression. You can maintain the same previous overload. In many cases, you can reduce the previous training load, different factors, and maintain that fitness for extended periods of time. But I'm going to assume that the goal is to keep making progress. Right? We're clear. Overload, the habitual stimulus that triggers the adaptation that needs to be progressed once that adaptation occurs, with no specific time frames being described here. Overload and the adaptation take as long as they take, and until the adaptation has occurred such that the previous training is no longer an overload, there is no fundamental need or reason to necessarily apply progression. And again, I'm beating this dead horse because in the fitness industry right now, people are confusing these terms. Oh, well, you can't add weight every week. Well, who said you should or could or need to? Not me. There are systems that suggest that you should be trying to improve every workout. Dog crap is like that, some weight training bodybuilding systems, but that's more conceptual. It's not saying you need necessarily to do, if you can, yeah, you should. You don't need to add weight if it's still a stimulating load. You don't need to add sets if it's still a stimulating load. You don't need to do more or harder or more frequent if what you're doing is still a stimulating load. Overload is the habitual stimulus. Progression occurs after the adaptation. Got it? So just for introduction, in previous parts, like when I talked about specificity, I tend to divide things up by sport because that made the most sense in that context. Here, I'm going to sort of do that, but I'm also going to talk really more about individual adaptations, right? So consider road cycling. I'm going to start with endurance sports, as always, right? It has multiple components, each of which is relatively more or less important, and each of which kind of has its own set of overload characteristics along with progressive overload characteristics, and those may not be the same. As I discuss these adaptations, again, probably within the context of a given sport or activity. If I can remember to, I will try to sort of first generally explain what the dominant component or components of the frequency intensity type interrelationship are, before looking at sort of how those come together to define overload and progression. To that, I'd add that in attempts to avoid excessive repetition, other sports may share components, like the physiological adaptations apply to more than just one thing. So building endurance, or the different components of endurance training, may apply to some degree to, say, team sports. Sprinting, which I may get to today, which many endurance athletes will do, also applies to the sprint sports. It's simply a matter of degree, focus, and importance. So I probably won't discuss sprint training, which I don't know a tremendous amount about to begin with, separately, because it simply includes the information on sprint training that will have applied to endurance sports for the most part. And I also try to not talk too far outside of my wheelhouse. So, endurance adaptations, I guess. As always, endurance sports, which is what I spent most of my life doing, it was actually pretty decent at. Probably what I'm physiologically and in many ways biomechanically built for. So as I talked about in the specificity section, long duration endurance activities. And here I'm going to use a little bit generally, like anything from about the mile up to the Tour de France is an endurance sport and has a number of different characteristics, training at the fringes that contribute to the performance package, including aerobic fitness, cardiovascular development, whatever you want to call that, some amount of anaerobic capacity and power, and then often top speed sprint, also VO2 max, which is a separate characteristic. Now, what proportion those will make up depends on the activity, right? Obviously, a mile, and the top people are running 3:45, something absurd like that, doesn't have nearly the long duration component as a marathon, and certainly not bike races, which are usually an hour at the minimum for, say, a criterium, which has its own characteristics, versus a point-to-point race or a long duration race, which could be hours, or the Tour, which is 4 to 6 hours a day for 3 straight weeks. But I'm not going to get into that because this isn't meant to be sport-specific training. It's more about the generalized adaptations. And in all of those cases, again, once you get past about 2-minute mark or so, a predominance of energy production is being made aerobically. And the percentage of that just goes up and up and up and up and up, where it may be 98% for a marathon or a 6-hour bike race or something like that. So the aerobic system is important for anything beyond that duration, just to a simply different and proportionally different degree. And just to reiterate, other sports, other than the endurance sports, can have an aerobic component, right? Boxers traditionally did a lot of road work for a number of reasons, but one is that a bigger aerobic engine helps you recover in between rounds, and the same holds for mixed martial artists. The same holds for those mixed team sports that may have an aerobic component so you can survive the duration of the event. And the training for those would be at least conceptually similar to what I'm going to talk about. I mean, each sport has its own way of doing it, but the ideas behind it would be similar. So let's start with that. Aerobic endurance, long duration aerobic endurance. So even though there are a bunch of individual adaptations that contribute to long duration endurance, including adaptations in the heart, then the lungs don't really adapt, changes to blood volume, oxygen carrying capacity in terms of hematocrit, capillary density, mitochondria, enzymes in the muscle. I'm going to treat that all as one because, generally speaking, to one degree or another, those adaptations occur to long duration endurance training. The goal, in the most general sense, of long duration endurance training of building the aerobic system is to improve your ability to A, generate energy aerobically, it's right there in the name, along with improving your ability to go submaximally for long durations. Because especially as the distance increases, the proportion of time spent relatively submaximally goes down. Now, if you're like an hour or less, you can go pretty much all out the whole time. When I was skating half marathons, which was about 40 minutes, none of that is done submaximally, right? I could just peg it at my something else that I'll come back to, maximum steady state or lactate threshold or FTP, whatever you want to call it. But as it gets past about an hour, you can't do that. And in most pack races, there are more tactics where you may be sitting in a pack and going relatively less all out because you have to. That's predominantly going to be aerobic. There's also the fact that the more power, the more speed that you can generate aerobically, the later you get into the highly fatiguing anaerobic component, right? Once you go above a certain point, you can no longer go for very long, right? Once you get into anaerobic metabolism, on top of being able to better recover between those hard bouts, right? Like an endurance event, if you have to chase somebody down or chase down the pack, like when I would get dropped off the back because I sucked at pack skating, I would have to go way above my aerobic level to catch them. And then I got to sit in, and the better your aerobic system is, the faster you can recover and be ready to go again. Let me note, obviously I'm not just talking about sports performance. What I'm going to discuss in many of these sections would also apply to someone training for general fitness, in that, we've stereotypically told people to do X amount of aerobic training for general cardiovascular health. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about will apply. Just in endurance sports, especially competitive endurance sports, it's taken to a much greater level in terms of how far it's progressed and how much training ends up being done. And I'll address that, and I'll try to address some of the differences. Again, this series isn't meant to be like a complete guide to training. It's a guide to principles. And these are already long enough without me discussing every possible nuance and possible situation. So let's get to it. Regardless, the goal of aerobic or endurance training, whatever you want to call it, for long durations, is developing these aerobic pathways, this cluster of adaptations, regardless of the specific goals. And in that, the goal is to improve your ability to sustain low-intensity activities. That is reflected in the components that define overload. And what that means is that overload is going to be predominantly focused on duration, right? If you're trying to develop a system that improves long duration activity, duration is going to be a primary stimulus. And here that means volume, which in the case of endurance sports, swimming accepted, because nobody understands swimming, sure as fuck not me. It's based on volume. It's based on the durations, which can vary enormously. A mile runner isn't going to do the same durations as a marathoner, who is not going to do the same durations as a road cyclist. And other sports like cross-country skiing, rowing, tend to be different. And let me note that running is very different. Well, not very different. It's different in a sense than all these other endurance sports for two reasons. One, the impact issue, which can get into injury stuff that I talked about in videos a million years ago about high frequency stuff. But also because it has an eccentric component, because you're landing and rebounding, it has a higher energetic cost on top of causing potentially more muscle damage than every other endurance sport that are concentric only. And you see this reflected in the way the training is done. So, for example, here's a chart that Steven Seiler put up in a 2009 paper showing annual hourly volumes for different endurance sports. And this really illustrates differences, right? So like annual distance running volumes may be 550 hours. Orienteering, which is running with the map, is a little bit higher, whereas cyclists are up at 1,200 hours, and swimmers, which do ridiculous volumes, is up at like 1,300 hours. So as like a rough rule of thumb, running volumes are typically about half what cycling and other endurance sports are. And again, it's because running has both an eccentric and a concentric component, and all the others are concentric only. So while I'm going to speak generally about these different overload and progressive overload components, running is a little bit different, right? Like if I say, oh, a 2-hour bike ride as an example, like the rough equivalent might be an hour run. Same thing when I discuss frequencies, because you can change, you can increased frequencies of the other endurance sports a lot more and a lot faster than running, because they don't tend to wreck you with joint injuries. But again, I'll try to make those distinctions if I can remember. This isn't meant to be all about training. Just keep that in mind, that running does have its own nuances because of the impact and the eccentric component that aren't seen in other endurance sports. Regardless, volume duration tends to be predominant. Now, frequency is also important, and in some ways more so than some of the other things I'm going to talk about. Again, we're looking at improving durational ability, and for reasons having to do with gene expression, the way the adaptations work, you have to send that signal fairly regularly. A minimum, generally speaking, of 3 times a week. And as I'll talk about progression, most high-level endurance athletes train far more frequently than that. Intensity, by definition, must be submaximal, right? By definition, you cannot do near maximal or above a certain point intensity for long durations, right? There's an inverse relationship between intensity and volume here. And the same is true of frequency. You can't do high intensities at high frequencies. Well, if durations are lower, but duration is sort of predominant, and like I said, this isn't meant to be a series on training more so than so much as general principles, but by and large, intensity is submaximal, volume is predominant, there needs to be a minimum frequency, and there's some variation in between that. So that's the most general sense. So how do those apply? Like I said, with frequency, you're looking at a minimum of 3 times a week to get any sort of real adaptation. There's been the occasional study that they call the weekend warrior syndrome, and doing like, for folks who only can do like 2 days a week on the weekends, they get something, but generally speaking, it's accepted that to get any aerobic adaptation, it's a minimum of 3 times per week. Jumping to volume, there are also minimum volumes. And from a base standpoint, right, if we're talking about beginners, 20 minutes tends to be the bare minimum, right? You have to stress that physiological system for long enough to tell the body to make those adaptations. And then intensity, like I said, tends to be very submaximal. And there's been a bunch of different ways to set intensity. The early ways were, maximum heart rate. And that was done because there's a generally good relationship between heart rate and oxygen uptake. I'm not going to get into those physiological details. There's also the Carvonen approach, which is a little bit more accurate way to use heart rate because it factored in both resting heart rate and maximal heart rate. Although when you did the math, it came out pretty damn close to just using heart rate. There's a bunch of problems with maximum heart rate, or using percentage of maximum heart rate, because the old 220 minus age is an average and doesn't hold for any given individual. In the modern era, it's more common to set aerobic intensities relative to measured thresholds, right? So in cycling, they define an aerobic threshold, which is a point below which, it's recovery riding, but it won't stimulate an adaptation. And once you cross that threshold, sometimes called lactate threshold 1, you are now in the aerobic zone. And if you get into this, people have set up both 3-zone systems and well as 5-zone systems, and these images both come from Seiler's paper again, that show, how these different things are defined. So if we're talking about aerobic endurance, we're talking about zone 2 in both categories. You can set it, cyclists typically set it to functional threshold power. That's the maximum you can maintain for an hour, and you set it as a percentage of that. Runners do a similar thing, usually typically with running speed. They do a test to determine, their maximum steady state, and it's set to that. That's arguably a better approach, but honestly, you generally see it somewhere in the range of like 120 beats per minute to about 140. It's kind of like your classic zone 2. Again, some variance. You can see variance in sports. Swimming is often a little bit lower because of being in water and being horizontal. Cycling is kind of in the middle. Running is often a little bit higher because it's more weight bearing. And while I'm talking about running, when people first start running, like total beginners, often they cannot run at a pace that will keep their heart rate in the quote-unquote aerobic zone. It just can't be done because there tends to be a minimum speed below which it's a walk and above which it's a run. And in between those two, you're doing that goofy ass race walking. So frequently when people start running, their heart rate just spikes way higher than it ideally would be. And it's just what you do until you get the adaptation and it comes back down. And each individual sport, and again, I don't know enough about cross-country skiing or rowing, it's probably very similar, has its own way of setting that zone 2 aerobic range, but they're closer than not. So in the most general sense, to create any sort of overload for the aerobic system, frequency, 3 times a week minimum, intensity, zone 2, the aerobic range, usually between 120, 140, maybe up to 150, depending on a bunch of variables in that range. Volume, 20 minutes minimum up to, some road cyclists will go 6 hours. Okay, so what constitutes progression? So what constitutes progression? So one thing, and this will pretty much hold for everything I talk about, is that the intensity in terms of running speed, power outputs, again, however the fuck they do it in swimming, will always be adjusted as part of the overload, no matter what else is being done, right? If we accept 120 to 140, 150-ish as the optimal aerobic intensity for stressing that system, as someone gets faster in their sport, they will have to increase the speed that they're working at, right? But they will never really increase it such that their heart rate is outside of that range. Right? You're not now, I'm going to say you're not. I'm going to talk about the next thing. You're not going to see someone trying to develop the aerobic system going, oh, I'm going to do 160 heart rate. The progression isn't in heart rate, but it will be progressed in terms of the speed that generates a given heart rate. And since someone will probably bring it up in the comments, yes, you could technically start at like 120 heart rate and then increase your heart rate over whatever number of weeks to make a workout harder while still staying within that range, right? So like if I were training a beginner, for example, I would try to target the low end of that heart rate to get the duration, to get the frequency. And before I progressed anything else, I might go, okay, let's have you work at 130 heart rate, a little bit harder. Now let's have you work at 140 heart rate. As a stimulus, again, still within the aerobic range. And if they're getting faster, we'll be adjusting it even then. So what I'm saying is you're always going to say within that 120 to 140. You're never going to go, well, I'm going to do 145 now or 160 or whatever. But you might work within that range depending on, again, the situation. And like I said, if you try to understand swimming, they have individual categories for different, there's zone 1, 2, 3 aerobic or type 1, 2, 3 aerobic of 120 to 130, 130 to 140, 140, 150, because swimming, I've been trying to understand it for 20 years and I give it the fuck up. But I think you get my point. So that's intensity. You will always be adjusting speed to maintain the appropriate heart rate and physiological stress. But you will not, and you might work within that range of heart rates in some sort of progressive or regressive fashion. But you would not progress heart rate or intensity outside of that heart rate range. But what about the other two? So what I gave is sort of the most general overload will be progressed, right? That would be absolutely adequate for a beginner in terms of generating the initial adaptations. And that's fairly standard, guidelines if you look at ACSM or most things. And that's where I always start people. Now, make no mistake, for some people just starting out, even 20 minutes of continuous aerobic activity can be too difficult, and you frequently have to build up to that. And again, I note that's especially true for running, because like I said, it tends to spike heart rate on top of the fact that people just get hurt. Honestly, most people should not just go start running distance. It is one of the activities you have to get in shape for first, right? I could put someone on a bike and have them go 120 heart rate from the get-go at a very low intensity. You can't do that running. Walk-run program where you alternate a few minutes of running, jog for a minute, a few minutes of walking, jog a minute and gradually increase the running bits while decreasing the walking bits is a far safer and better way to move into running. And I'll link to an article a buddy of mine named Andrew Reed wrote, which is a great walk-run program. Or you can just take my advice, which is don't fucking run unless you're being chased. That's neither here nor there. But assuming they're at that point and they get an adaptation, again, they're always going to increase the intensity of activity. If you're on an indoor machine, you're increasing the level on the machine. If the elliptical level 10 puts you at 120, 130 heart rate, and 6 weeks from now, which is about how long it takes to get an aerobic adaptation, it's only putting you at 120 or less, you go to 11 to maintain the heart rate intensity. But what about the other two? Well, over time, depending on the sport, or even a more general fitness or calorie burning goal, there will generally be an increase in frequency. I don't think you'll find any high-level endurance athletes only training 3 times a week. Whereas the general fitness person, that may be more than sufficient to develop basic cardiovascular fitness. In running, over time, it will eventually become daily. And again, this is a multi-year process. And then many runners, because there tends to be a limit, right? You can only run a given duration per workout, and running tends to be more time delimited than other activities. Back in the day, many runners would add an easy morning run. They would add an extra 30 minutes, which increased the volume, weekly total duration. We know now if it's done fasted, it may have some separate adaptations. And there's a way of increasing the frequency, of getting more frequent stimuli. That again was at a very advanced level, years down the road, when they had reached the limit of weekly frequencies. And then if you look at the Kenyan runners, those guys are nuts, right? They will typically run 3 times a day, 6 days a week at the highest levels. And occasionally you'll find a maniac running 4. And it's usually fasted morning run, the easy run, and then the daily, the lunchtime run will be something more quality, which I'll talk about intervals and stuff here momentarily. And then they'll do usually, like, I think, a longer aerobic run in the afternoon. So that's frequency in running. Cycling, for the most part, has not ever gone to 2-a-day workouts because the workouts are proportionally much longer durationally, and it wouldn't be realistic, right? If you're a cyclist and you're already doing a 4-hour ride, you're not going to fit in an additional hour. Because as I wrote about 1 billion years ago on my website, cyclists already do about twice the weekly volumes of runners. So there's just not really any time. It's not realistic to try to add a second daily workout to get whatever benefits runners are getting. I can't speak to most other endurance sports, but swimming at the highest level, traditionally 6 days a week, twice a day, because they do massive volumes. But frequency will typically start at 3 times a week and will gradually build up. That is a form of overload. Now, there is absolutely a point of diminishing returns, above which you're getting incrementally less gains by adding another day. For elite athletes, that's valuable. For everybody else, not so much. And 3 days a week will get the majority of the gains you're going to get. Higher frequencies might be beneficial for other goals. Let me mention, like, if you're in a cutting diet fat loss phase, you may be doing daily aerobic activity for calorie burn. And if you're looking at smaller physique athletes at the extremes of low body fat, as much as the industry likes to shit on it, doing low intensity cardio twice a day is often not only beneficial but necessary because it's the only way to maintain the deficit. Again, that's at the extremes. And even those athletes should do it gradually. You don't bring in the extra cardio for a contest diet until you need it. You don't do it proactively just because. But if we're talking about performance adaptations, 3 times a week gets you most of what you're going to get. And over time, most athletes will add more. But you can also add duration. So I mentioned 20 minutes is kind of a minimum starting point, and that will generally go up. Now, if you look at most guidelines for general fitness and health, usually an hour is listed as really the upper limit. It's hard for me to tell, because I haven't looked at the research in 1 billion years, whether that's a physiological limit or just a reality limit, a practical limit. The average person, which is who these guidelines are for, average fitness, time is the biggest or most commonly reported roadblock to regular exercise. So telling someone to go, well, if you're doing an hour, go to 90 minutes per workout is usually unrealistic. They just don't have the time. So for the average person, 60 minutes progressing over time is probably sufficient. And again, contextually, for someone that only has 30 minutes or 40 minutes, who cannot increase duration, who wants to provide more of a stimulus, they may be better adding a fourth day of 30 minutes rather than trying to stay at 3 days and go up in volume. But it's one of those two that's generally going to be modified in terms of progression if you're talking about general fitness type stuff. Endurance athletes over time will be progressing both. And again, the type of activity you're doing can also impact on this. If you're a beginning runner, you will be starting at 3 days a week, and once you get to 20 minutes, you're far better off adding duration slowly, by which I mean like 5 minutes per workout every couple of weeks. The old rule of thumb is no more than a 10% increase in mileage every week, because otherwise you get hurt. And you may be better off increasing duration to give your connective tissue time to recover between the runs before adding a fourth weekly run. Whereas in any other activity, cycling, whatever indoor exercise that doesn't have that impact, you can technically increase frequency much more quickly. I mean, a beginning cyclist could go start riding 6 days a week. They may chafe their asshole raw, but they're probably not going to get knee problems like they would if they did that running. So running is, again, kind of an exception to all these other endurance sports. And I would just note again, my advice if you want to run is don't, unless you're being chased. It gets people hurt, and there's better ways to get fit. And the same holds true for duration. I already mentioned with running, durational increases should happen very, very gradually to let the body and connective tissue to give it time to adapt. Whereas in other activities, a cyclist, it could take them, they could technically probably go out and ride an hour their first day. I don't know that I would recommend it for a beginner, but it could be done. And it can be progressed very, very quickly because, again, the worst thing that happens is you chafe your butt raw if you don't have a good pair of shorts and a good saddle. And the same is true for other non-impact activities where you can technically increase duration a lot more quickly. But that's how the progression goes. Intensity will always be progressed to maintain the appropriate heart rate. Heart rate will not be progressed outside of the zone 2 aerobic range, though it might be varied within that range for certain contextual goals, by and large. And I can't think of any examples. Frequency, which starts at 3 times a week, can be progressed gradually. And volume can be increased in terms of duration as someone becomes fitter. Now, my general advice to people, assuming they have the time, would be, again, rank beginner. Start at 3 times a week in zone 2, 120 to 140, roughly. You can also use something called the talk test. If you can keep a broken conversation during your aerobic work, that's the appropriate intensity. If you can talk like I am now, it's too easy. If you can only take one word, that's too high of an intensity. Broken conversation. That's going to put you at, or if you want to use RPE, like on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is sitting on the couch and 10 is an all-out sprint, 3 to 4. Challenging but not impossible, that's zone 2. That'll put you right where you need to be without even ever fucking around with heart rate. And then volumes, which start at 20 minutes, will increase durationally. So I recommend everyone start there as a complete beginner. I would generally prefer people add duration first at that intensity before adding frequency. So if you're doing an elliptical and you've done 30 minutes 3 times a week at a given heart rate for 6 weeks, which again is about how long it takes to get aerobic adaptations, they tend to be much slower. You might stay at 3 times a week. You're always adjusting intensity to keep you in the right heart rate. And you might be adding, you might add 5 minutes if you're running and must run, and you might add 10 minutes on a lower impact. And you can add volume, you can add faster if you want to. If you want to build up from 20 minutes to 45 or 60, that's usually to burn more calories, even though the calorie burn during aerobic activity is jack and shit for most people. That can be done, but again, why do more than you have to if that's going to get the adaptation? So my general recommendation for aerobic training is start at the low end. First, build duration, build volume over time, and more slowly for running than any other activity. When you reach an upper limit of time that your schedule will allow, and maybe that's 45 minutes 3 times a week at a given intensity that generates the right heart rate, RPE, whatever, then you might add a 4th session. And that would be it. You'd add that 1 session a week. Again, way more important for running than other activities. Now you're doing 4 sessions of 45 minutes at the appropriate intensity. Wait for the next adaptation. If you can add time, add time. If your schedule won't allow it, maybe you add a 5th day. If you've been working at the lower end of the aerobic range, that 120, 130, and can add frequency and can add duration, you might decide to work at 140, which is still higher, will burn more calories, will be more of a stimulus within that limited time. You might even go to 150, but anything above that and you're outside the aerobic zone. So even with competition, it comes down to what level you're trying to reach in terms of how many days per week you may end up training total. So far as the aerobic engine, we haven't discussed the other components of aerobic training. But regardless, aerobic training will make up the grand majority of the training for endurance sports, kind of no matter what you do. So there are variations within this in terms of what you might progress, how quickly you might progress, to what degree you might progress, depending on what level of competition, what sport you're doing, what your goals are, all that shit that I cannot possibly discuss here because this is too long already. And I cannot believe it took me that long to discuss that one topic. God help me if we have to do this for every adaptation. Regardless, let's move on. I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about our anaerobic threshold training, but it won't take nearly as long because at least in an endurance sport setting, the amount of work done at this level is much, much, much less than it used to be like back in the 80s and 90s. Typically what you see in most endurance sports these days is called polarized training, where like 85% of the training is done at these low-ass intensities. And then there's a little bit of top-end work with much less in this kind of middle range, with one exception, something you do see in cycling and maybe in running, called sweet spot training that has to do with when people are very time constrained, and I'll address that at the end. How you develop what used to be called the anaerobic threshold, functional threshold power. It's basically the highest speed you can maintain for a solid hour, which is just indicative of sort of general training. Runners, especially at the marathon, they have that too. They also have what's called marathon pace, which is a little bit lower than that. Because again, once you get past an hour, you cannot maintain that limit, upper limit threshold above which you would be totally anaerobic. You're a little bit below that for most of the race. So they'll do something similar to this in terms of running at marathon pace. All right, basic overload. So as I described, this anaerobic threshold, functional threshold power is a definition of, like, it's a much higher intensity than long duration aerobic, because it's the maximum speed you can maintain for an hour. Below that, you can go much, much longer. And above that, you're very time delimited because you've gone into anaerobic metabolism. So as such, we see a shift in those frequency, intensity, volume components, because now intensity has gone significantly up. And in the context of those 3 and 5 zone models, you can see the high end of zone 2 is maximal lactate steady state, lactate threshold 2, ventilatory threshold 2. Cyclists would define that as FTP. And in the 5 zone, it would be zone 4, 30 to 60 minutes. Again, ideally, you would set this relative to, a functional threshold, an actual maximal test. In practice, depending on the sport, depending on the person and their fitness, usually it's a heart rate between maybe 160 up to about 180, right? When I was inline racing, I could peg my heart rate at 180 for a solid hour, and I could stay there. Any faster, and I would blow up physiologically, and any lower than that, and I could go much, much, much longer. That was for me. It does vary. Insofar as other methods, like at anaerobic threshold, you will be sucking wind. You will be keeping this kind of conversation, and RPE is going to be up in like the 6 to 7 range, and I'll come back to that in a second. So because intensity is up, frequency and volumes go way down. Typically, even marathon speed. Again, swimming is different because it's non-impact. I don't understand it. I'm not going to try to pretend to understand it. Would typically be done on the bike, maybe a maximum of twice a week, maybe only once a week. It's very, very, very intense, right? It's what I guess in the fitness industry they might call high intensity steady state. It's not something you can do a lot of because it's extremely fatiguing, both physiologically, psychologically, and it's harder to recover from. Like every minute of time at that speed fucking hurts. So frequency once or twice a week. And the volumes are extremely time delimited. Said an hour maximum, although it would be extremely atypical for someone to do a solid hour at that pace. It's brutal. I've done hour time trials. I was in a research study where I was a subject and had to do 2 of them a week apart. It's fucking brutal. So typically the volumes are broken up to get a total duration. Generally, you start at maybe 1 20-minute block, which could be broken up early on, 4 by 5 minutes, with like maybe a 1-minute break. Just enough to give you that little bit of respite before you have to go back into the fucking pain zone. And then you work up to 2 by 10 minutes. And then you work up to 1 by 20 minutes. That would be a good beginner level threshold type of training. And again, this is probably sport specific. Running will probably be towards the lower end initially and likely done once a week. Whereas cyclists, back when they used to do a lot of it, 20 minutes might be at the low end. It's a good place to start. But 2 by 20 minutes, 40 minutes total would be a pretty typical duration as far as overload. And at the highest levels, they might put in a total of 1 hour. But that's about it. It's fucking hard. All right, so basic anaerobic threshold FTT parameters. Frequency relatively low, 1 to 2 times per week in most sports. Intensity relatively higher, which means high zone 2 in a 3-zone system and zone 4 in a 5-zone system. Generally somewhere between 160 and 180 heart rate depending. And then typically a minimum of 20 up to an absolute maximum of about 60 minutes of total duration, which is generally broken up into smaller blocks like 2 by 20 minutes or 4 by 10 minutes, stuff like that. And let me just note, you can get Coggin's book for this, that there are different workouts than just doing, pegging that for duration that can develop this capacity. Like one of the workouts Coggin has in his book is you developed FTP threshold and you do a few minutes below and then you kind of wave up and then you come back down so that the average intensity is there. But I'm trying to keep this simple. Again, this is not a series on how to train for all sports. But let me go ahead and mention sweet spot training, and this is a cycling concept. Again, Andrew Coggin came up with this, and it has to do with the fact that in running, right, 4 hours a week is a pretty decent training load and will get you adaptations. And in cycling, 4 hours a week doesn't do shit at low intensities, right? Like, I guess what folks have kind of found, like, unless you can do 10 to 12 hours a week on the bike, low intensity training by itself does not get the fitness because of the nature of cycling. So when you are very time delimited, or maybe it's winter and you don't want to do long rides indoors because it's fucking awful, you can do what Coggin calls sweet spot training. And that's simply, if this is your FTP, you're working at like 85 to 95% of that for long durations. The idea is to get the similar physiological stimulus to both what long duration training plus like direct FTP work would do. It's a time constraint thing, right? I did a consultation with a guy a couple years ago who, for reasons, decided he wanted to do a 7-hour mountain bike ride, but he was in a place with hard winter. Giving him 2-hour bike rides indoors is a great way to crack someone mentally. I've done it, and look at me. So I had him doing 3 sweet spot rides, right, of an hour apiece. And then he did 1 VO2 max interval, which I'll have to talk about in part 3 because this is running too long. And it was a way to get him fitness gains with a very short time commitment. Again, runners don't need to do this because 3 to 4 hours of running a week is a stimulus. 3 to 4 hours of cycling a week won't do anything at low intensities. So you bring it up. So that is an exception to what I talked about in terms of the FTP frequency, right? Like you wouldn't probably do true threshold work 4 days a week, but you could do sweet spot, which as I think about it is kind of like marathon pace training. You could do that 3 to 4 days a week. And in the case where that's all the time you've got, that will at least get you fitness gains, right? Even as Coggin says, will that prepare you for a 6-hour bike ride? Absolutely not. You will not have the long duration aerobic endurance. Will that give you a top end for sprints? Absolutely not. But it will improve your fitness when you've only got 4 hours to train. So that's sweet spot. So that's the basic overload parameters. Progression. So as far as progression on these types of workouts, again, as always, you will be increasing the intensity, the power output, the running speed as you adapt to that to maintain that heart rate. But you don't ever, progress heart rate outside of that range. That's where you are. Frequency doesn't progress on this. I'm sure elite level cyclists will do occasional blocks where they may do more of this. In general, it's going to be 1 or 2 times a week. Again, swimming, maybe they progress it from early in the career to later. Ask a swim coach, because it ain't me. I can't claim to be up on modern running training, but I doubt they do marathon pace work more than once a week. It's just too intense. It's hard on the body. So someone can correct me on that. But again, running, pretty much cut everything in half. Anything, whether it's durations or whatever, cut it in half compared to other sports because it's about twice as intense on the body. You will see, in general, progressions in duration in terms of the total volumes, right? Again, you can do up to an hour at this pace. So you might see someone go from 20 total minutes. And again, for cyclists, 2 by 20 minutes is pretty common because you can do that without the impact. And maybe way down the road, they might be doing 40 minutes of total time. And then at the highest levels, you might see 60 minutes. And like I said, it's most common to break those 20-minute segments into shorter segments. Like you typically, and that's another method of progression. You start at 4 by 5 minutes with a minute break. Then you go to 2 by 10 minutes with a 1 or 2 minute break. And then you go, I guess, 1 by 15 plus 1 by 5, whatever. You can't divide that up evenly. And then finally, you're doing 20 minutes at the same pace, which again, fucking brutal. Then you might, assuming your FTP has gone up, assuming that your speed is now faster, you might bump the intensity and go back to 4 by 5 minutes and build that up again over a number of weeks. Again, this comes from Seiler's paper. And if you look at zone 4, you can see some typical workouts. 10 by 6 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes recovery. 8 by 5 minutes, that's 40 minutes total. 15 by 3 minutes, 40 minutes by 1 minute with a 30-second recovery. 10 by 5 by 40 seconds, 20-second recovery. 30, 40 minutes steady state. But it's all basically in that range, 40 to 60 minutes total at the highest levels, which mean earlier on you're not doing that. And that chart shows, how you break these workouts up to be a lot more survivable by and large. And again, you can technically progress within those durations. So rather than 3 by 15 minutes, you start with whatever 9 by 5 minutes and then go to, 3 by 10 minutes, another 5-minute block, and then you work up to 3 by 15, and then you bump the intensity and come back up. The key is to get the total duration. For most people, 1 20-minute block will get some adaptations and still sucks as a workout. Trust me, it sucks. They might work up to 40 minutes total over a fairly long time span, right? As long as your power outputs are going up at that heart rate, there's no fundamental reason to add durations. You're better off using increases in block duration. Same total volume, longer per section. Trust me, by the time you get from 4 by 5 minutes to 1 by 20 minutes, it's hard. And again, aerobic adaptations of this sort do take a while, right? Like 4 to 6 weeks. And then you go, and all of a sudden the workout that was murderous suddenly becomes easy. On the bike, it's called the feeling that the chain fell off. So it's not like you're going to be increasing the wattage or the intensity of these efforts like week to week or every couple of weeks. It takes a while for these adaptations to occur. And let me note again that this type of training hurts, right? Long duration, low intensity aerobic training may be boring, but threshold training is suffering. When I used to do those workouts, I would put off starting the workout because once you start that 20-minute block right at your maximum sustainable threshold, it's nothing but pain for 20 minutes. It is unrelenting. So the hour time trials I did were exhausting. The skate races, 45 minutes, pegged at 180 heart rate, are brutal. You don't train like that regularly. You block them out, you get the total training volume, and you put that shit together on race day. Moving on. And for that reason, I see very little purpose of this type of training for anyone but a performance athlete. The general public to do this type of training, it's not sustainable. I see no real purpose to it. Like you can do higher intensity aerobic activity up at 150, 160 for shorter periods of time, but to go at actual threshold levels for extended durations is nothing but pain. Whereas interval training, which is going to have to wait for part 3 because this took way too long, may have a role not only for performance athletes, but in some contexts for the general public. See you next time. Oh yeah, I don't respond to comments or questions, but I won't delete them either, like all these other people do. If you have a question for me, you can send it to questions@bodyrecomposition.com, and you probably won't get an answer, but hey, you never know.